Many people describe the Chevrolet C10 from 1960 to 1972 as one of the most iconic American pickups ever made, but behind its charm, design evolution, and reputation for toughness, there were several flaws that owners, collectors, and even mechanics have quietly dealt with for decades. These trucks became symbols of rural America, small towns, farms, and home garages, and for that reason alone, many enthusiasts prefer to highlight the good side: reliability, simplicity, easy maintenance, and the timeless look. But anyone who has lived long enough restoring one, driving one daily, or rebuilding one piece by piece knows that the C10, regardless of the generation, had issues that were rarely mentioned in advertisements, rarely acknowledged by GM at the time, and often hidden by collectors who didn't want to damage the truck's legendary image. Behind the nostalgia, there were mechanical and structural weaknesses that required patience, improvisation, and sometimes a bit of luck to deal with. Across the entire production from 1960 to 1972, the C10 went through several engineering updates, generational redesigns, engine swaps, and technological changes that shaped its character. Yet even with all those improvements, certain defects remained persistent from the early models to the later ones, especially when it came to rust, braking inconsistencies, steering wear, electrical problems, and suspension issues that caused unpredictable behavior on the road. People admire these trucks for being bulletproof, but the reality is that many of them survived not because they were perfect, but because owners learned how to live with their problems and adjust to the truck instead of expecting the truck to adjust to them. One of the earliest problems that quietly followed the C10 over 12 years of production was the tendency for rust to appear in critical areas, often hidden until it was too late. The combination of American road salt, humid climates, and the type of steel used in the era meant that rust found its way into door bottoms, rocker panels, the cab corners, and the frame rails near the rear axle. Many restorers today call it the silent cancer of the C10, because even trucks that appear solid on the outside can hide severe structural corrosion underneath. During the 1960s, rust-proofing technology was much more primitive than what would come in later decades, and GM did not apply strong protective coatings or galvanization on many of these surfaces. As a result, a truck could look beautiful with fresh paint, yet still be dangerously weakened underneath, especially around the trailing arm crossmember that was known to crack or corrode on many trucks built during the mid to late 60s. Owners kept quiet about it because rust was considered a normal part of truck ownership in those years, but anyone restoring one today often spends more time cutting out rusted steel than rebuilding mechanical components. Another defect that owners tried to hide was the issue with the braking systems used between 1960 and 1972. Chevrolet introduced several improvements during this period, including the transition from drum-only configurations to front disc brakes in 1971. But for more than a decade, drivers relied on drum brakes that overheated under load, faded during long descents, and behaved inconsistently when wet. Many people who grew up driving these trucks learned to control braking distances with caution, almost anticipating that the truck might not stop exactly when expected. And although brakes were acceptable for the standards of the era, they were far from ideal. The weakness became even more noticeable when the truck was used as intended, hauling heavy loads, towing equipment, or navigating gravel roads and mountain downhill routes. Drum brakes needed constant adjustment, cleaning, and maintenance, yet many owners simply continued driving until the fade became dangerous. When front discs finally arrived in 1971, it was a revolution for the C10, but it arrived late enough that many trucks spent their entire lives with the older and more problematic system. Steering components also created a long history of headaches. The C10, especially models from the early and mid-1960s, suffered from excessive play in the steering box, worn idler arms, and loose tie rods that made the truck wander on the highway. It was not unusual for drivers to fight the steering wheel constantly, correcting the truck's path every few seconds. The recirculating ball steering boxes installed at the time were durable but prone to developing slack, requiring adjustments that only temporarily solved the problem. And because many of these trucks were used on farms or rough terrain, the front-end components wore out quickly. Some mechanics joked that driving a used C10 was like piloting a boat on land, because the steering response could feel delayed or unpredictable. Yet owners rarely talked about it openly, because an old truck with loose steering was seen as normal, part of its rugged personality. Still, it was undeniably a design weakness that should have received more attention during the production years. Electrical issues also followed the C10 from the 1960s into the early 1970s. The wiring harnesses used in the trucks were simple, but the insulation material aged poorly, especially in hot climates. Over time, wires cracked, connectors corroded, and grounds loosened, causing flickering lights, malfunctioning gauges, and intermittent stalling. Many owners experienced strange electrical glitches that were never officially recognized as common defects. GM's electrical designs were functional but not well protected against moisture or vibration, two things that trucks experience constantly. The fuse box, mounted low on the firewall, was also vulnerable to humidity and corrosion. A surprising number of C10 owners silently rewired parts of their trucks without ever mentioning the real reasons behind the repair. For many of these trucks, maintaining reliable electricity became a matter of personal improvisation, replacing wires one by one instead of relying on the original harness. Collectors today often find that the hardest part of a restoration is not the engine or the body, but unraveling decades of electrical patches created to fix problems that owners never wanted to admit. Suspension issues also remained present in different ways across the 12 years of production. Although the C10 introduced independent front suspension in 1960, which was advanced for a truck of its era, the system created unexpected wear points that mechanics saw repeatedly. Ball joints wore out quickly on trucks that carried heavy loads, bushings deteriorated faster than expected, and the coil spring rear suspension, while comfortable, often sagged over time, especially on trucks used for towing. The trailing arm suspension used from 1963 onward provided a smooth ride but introduced new problems, including cracked crossmembers, bent arms, and worn bushings that caused clunking noises and unstable handling. People loved the smoothness of the C10 compared to other pickups, but the price they paid was more maintenance, uneven tire wear, and sudden instability when components aged or loosened. Even today, many restorers discover that the rear suspension of their truck has been repaired multiple times over its life, often with improvised welding done by previous owners who preferred to hide the structural weakness rather than advertise it. Throughout the 1960 to 1972 production run, another issue that many drivers preferred not to discuss was engine inconsistency. The straight-six engines were known for reliability, but they suffered from oil leaks, worn valve seals, and occasional overheating when neglected. The small-block V8 engines introduced during the era brought more power but also introduced new problems with carburetors that clogged easily, fuel pumps that failed unexpectedly, and timing chains that stretched over time, altering engine performance. Owners often developed a habit of carrying extra parts in the truck, like a spare fuel pump or ignition coil, because they knew that certain failures were almost unavoidable. While these engines became legendary for their durability, the truth is that they required attention and constant adjustment, especially when the trucks aged. Many owners talked proudly about how reliable their engines were, but rarely mentioned the oil stains on the driveway or the carburetor rebuilds that happened every few years. Another hidden defect that accompanied the C10 through the 60s and early 70s was the quality of the cabin ventilation and weather sealing. Door seals wore out quickly, cowl vents leaked water into the interior during heavy rain, and windows often rattled or loosened from the regulators. Owners became accustomed to hearing wind noise at high speeds, and many learned to place towels on the floor mats during storms to prevent water from collecting under the carpet or rubber flooring. Because ventilation design was simple and air conditioning was not standard for most trucks of the era, the cab could become unbearably hot in summer and drafty in winter. For decades, people considered these discomforts as part of the charm of classic trucks, but it was nonetheless a design weakness that Chevrolet did not fully address until later generations. Despite all of these issues, the C10 remained beloved. Part of this paradox comes from the way trucks were perceived in mid-century America. People expected their pickups to be rugged, imperfect machines that required hands-on maintenance. A truck was a tool, not a luxury item, and because of this cultural mindset, many of its flaws were never publicly criticized. If the brakes faded, you drove slower. If the steering wandered, you learned how to correct it instinctively. If the suspension sagged, you welded reinforcements or replaced springs. Problems were not viewed as deal-breakers but as challenges that came with ownership. This explains why so many owners maintained silence about defects that modern drivers would instantly reject in a new vehicle. But as time passed and these trucks turned into collectibles, restorers and enthusiasts began uncovering the reality hidden behind nostalgia. They found cracked frames, rust hidden under body filler, electrical systems patched with household wiring, engines held together by decades of improvisation, and suspensions worn down from years of abuse. The iconic status of the C10 did not erase its weaknesses, it only overshadowed them for a while. And as restoration shops began documenting their work, more people realized that these problems were not isolated incidents or accidents of neglect, they were patterns inherent to the design and materials of the era. Even so, the C10 continues to attract new fans, restorers, and collectors because its flaws do not erase its charm. On the contrary, many enthusiasts argue that these imperfections are part of what makes the truck special. There is a certain pride in taking something flawed but beautiful and restoring it to life, understanding its weaknesses, and appreciating the engineering of a different era. Owning a classic C10 means accepting its history, flaws included, and embracing the effort it takes to preserve a machine that was never meant to last 6 decades. The pride does not come from perfection, it comes from the journey of keeping something alive that others would have abandoned long ago. These hidden defects, the ones that people chose not to talk about, helped shape the C10's legacy more than most owners realize. They forced people to learn deeper mechanical skills, to adapt their driving habits, and to understand the truck beyond its surface appearance. The C10 became more than just a pickup, it became a teacher, a companion, and sometimes a challenge. And that challenge created a bond between owner and machine that modern trucks rarely replicate, because today's vehicles are built to shield drivers from flaws, not teach them how to handle them. As the years went by, owners discovered even more subtle weaknesses that were rarely discussed publicly but became part of the lived experience of operating a C10. One of these issues was the inconsistency of build quality across factories and model years. Trucks assembled at different plants often displayed varying levels of fit and finish, especially regarding body panel alignment, weld uniformity, and interior assembly. It was not uncommon for doors to require extra force to close or for fenders to sit slightly uneven. These imperfections were usually dismissed as characteristic of a working truck, but they indicated a lack of precision in assembly processes of the era. For collectors today, these differences sometimes create confusion when evaluating the authenticity of restored trucks because what might appear to be a mistake was, in fact, how the vehicle originally left the factory. Owners rarely blamed Chevrolet for these inconsistencies, preferring instead to accept them as part of what made their truck unique. Another lesser-known problem that persisted across the 1960 to 1972 range was the tendency for dashboards, interior plastics, and seat foam to degrade more quickly than expected. UV exposure through the large, vertical windshield caused dashboards to crack, and the vinyl seats often split along the seams after only a few years of heavy use. While this might seem like a minor cosmetic issue, it contributed to discomfort and a sense of premature aging inside the cab. Many owners covered these cracks with homemade dash pads or improvised vinyl repairs, often hiding the true condition from future buyers. Even though Chevrolet did not intentionally hide this weakness, the lack of durable materials meant that interiors aged faster than the engines or frames. Today, restorers must often replace or completely rebuild the entire interior, a process that reveals how quickly time and sun exposure destroyed the original components. One of the most interesting and often hidden defects involved the fuel system. Vapor lock, when gasoline evaporates in the fuel lines, preventing the engine from receiving liquid fuel, was a common issue during hot weather. The combination of engine bay heat, metal fuel lines routed too close to the exhaust manifold, and the volatility of gasoline formulations of the era created conditions ripe for vapor lock. When it happened, the truck would stall or refuse to start until the components cooled down, leaving drivers confused and stranded. Many old-timers developed tricks to keep the truck running, such as adding wooden clothespins to the fuel lines to act as improvised heat sinks or pouring cool water over the metal lines in emergencies. These solutions became part of the folklore of owning a C10, quietly passed from one generation to another, yet never widely acknowledged as a design flaw. Chevrolet never formally addressed vapor lock in service bulletins, which meant the problem remained one of the many hidden truths that only frequent drivers came to understand. Another element that contributed to the hidden defect list was the cabin ergonomics, or lack thereof. The driving position of the early C10 models was not designed with comfort in mind. The steering wheel sat high and far from the driver's chest, the pedals were angled awkwardly, and the bench seat offered limited adjustability. Long drives could leave the driver's back stiff and legs sore. While later models improved this aspect slightly, they never reached a truly comfortable standard by modern expectations. Owners seldom complained publicly, because comfort was not a priority for pickup buyers in the 1960s. Still, the poor ergonomics contributed to fatigue, especially for those who used the truck for work. This issue went largely unnoticed in contemporary reviews but became evident years later when enthusiasts compared the C10 to later generations of trucks that provided better driver support. Noise was another hidden companion of the Chevrolet C10. The combination of thin door panels, limited insulation, and rigid mountings for the engine and transmission meant that noise from the road, wind, suspension, and engine echoed through the cabin. Owners became accustomed to hearing the growl of the small-block V8 or the hum of the straight-six reverberate inside the truck. Rattles from loose interior components, vibrating door windows, and clunks from worn suspension bushings also became part of the soundtrack of everyday driving. Many enthusiasts romanticize these sounds today, calling them the music of an old truck, but at the time, the noise contributed to fatigue and discomfort. Sound insulation technology was limited, and Chevrolet did not prioritize quietness in these models. Most of the unwanted noise was treated as normal, and owners simply drove with the windows down, letting the wind drown out the mechanical chorus inside the cab. The climate control system of the C10, especially in trucks without factory air conditioning, also presented quiet frustrations. The heaters in early models were adequate but relied on old-style coolant valves and cable-operated flaps that often stuck or became misaligned. As a result, some trucks suffered from weak heating, slow defrosting, or inconsistent airflow. Without air conditioning, the cab became extremely hot during summer months, especially in humid regions like the American South. Drivers learned to rely on ventilation windows and cabin airflow, but these small triangular vent windows, although useful, often allowed dust and odors into the cab. Their seals degraded quickly, and many owners found themselves inhaling road dust or cold winter drafts through gaps they could not fully seal. Over the years, these issues became part of the truck's personality rather than documented defects, but they were nevertheless shortcomings that modern owners must confront during restoration. As the trucks aged, another problem emerged that was rarely openly discussed: frame flex and structural stress after decades of hauling loads. The C10 frame was strong for its era, but it was not designed to remain perfectly rigid 50 or 60 years later. Trucks used extensively for towing or carrying heavy materials developed subtle bends or stress cracks, particularly near the rear suspension mounts and crossmembers. These issues often went unnoticed at first, manifesting only as unusual tire wear or slight misalignment in the body. Over time, however, frame fatigue became a real concern for restorers. Some discovered that their trucks had been bent and straightened multiple times over the decades, and others found aftermarket reinforcements welded onto the frame to prevent further damage. These repairs were often performed quietly by previous owners who did not consider them defects but rather necessary modifications for a hardworking truck. Today, they serve as reminders that many C10s lived demanding lives, and their structural integrity reflects the stress of those years. Perhaps one of the most enduring and least discussed issues involved the carburetors used on the C10 engines. While carburation was standard at the time, the specific designs used on many C10 models were highly sensitive to dirt, low-quality fuel, and improper tuning. A carburetor slightly out of adjustment could cause rough idle, hesitation, poor fuel economy, or stalling. Many owners spent years making small adjustments, cleaning jets, replacing gaskets, and learning the delicate balance required to keep the carburetor performing correctly. It was not uncommon to see a C10 parked with its hood open while the owner made on-the-spot adjustments with a screwdriver. These issues were rarely described as defects because carburetor tuning was considered a normal part of vehicle ownership in that era. Still, The constant need for fine-tuning made the C10 less user-friendly than modern trucks with fuel injection, and the problem continues to affect restorers who want to maintain originality. Fuel economy was another quiet frustration. While no one expected exceptional efficiency from a mid-century truck, the C10 was particularly thirsty, especially with V8 engines and automatic transmissions. The combination of carbureted fueling, outdated combustion chamber design, and heavy curb weight meant that these trucks consumed large amounts of gasoline. Yet people seldom complained because, during the 1960s, fuel was cheap and expectations for efficiency were low. Today, however, the reality of the C10's poor fuel economy becomes more apparent. Many owners quietly accept that their fully restored truck will achieve single-digit miles per gallon in city driving, and few are eager to emphasize this fact to newcomers who romanticize the idea of owning a classic pickup. Overheating was another hidden enemy for many C10s. Radiators from the era were prone to clogging, water pumps experienced wear, and cooling systems required constant attention. Trucks used in hot climates or for heavy work often ran on the edge of acceptable operating temperatures. Owners learned to drive with caution, especially during summer, and some installed auxiliary fans or aftermarket radiators without mentioning it publicly. These modifications helped solve the issue but also revealed that the factory cooling system had limitations. Today, restorers frequently upgrade cooling components, even when aiming for authenticity, because they understand that the original design was not robust enough for long-term reliability under modern conditions. For all these reasons, the Chevrolet C10, 1960 to 1972, became a vehicle defined not just by its strengths but also by its flaws that owners learned to manage, hide, or quietly repair without much discussion. The silence around these defects contributed to the creation of a myth, the idea that old American trucks were perfect symbols of durability and toughness. While they were indeed strong and capable machines, they were not invincible. They required skill, patience, and a willingness to accept imperfections as part of the ownership experience. The hidden truths behind the C10 do not diminish its greatness, rather, they highlight the real relationship between drivers and their machines during an era when vehicles demanded far more involvement from their owners. Looking back today, the C10 remains beloved not because it was flawless but because it represented a time when machines were simple, mechanical, and honest. Every defect forced owners to understand how their truck worked, to listen to its noises, and to interpret its behaviors. A C10 with loose steering taught precision. A C10 with weak brakes taught anticipation. A C10 with rust taught vigilance. A C10 with a leaky valve cover taught basic maintenance. Each flaw became a lesson, and each lesson created a stronger connection between person and machine. Modern vehicles, with their electronic systems and digital diagnostics, rarely create such intimate bonds. The C10 required attention and rewarded those who gave it. The hidden defects of the C10 also shaped the culture around these trucks. Families passed down stories of roadside repairs, home garage rebuilds, and moments when the truck tested their patience. These stories became part of the truck's identity, blending frustration with affection. People rarely speak openly about these problems because doing so might damage the image of a beloved classic. Yet the truth remains, the C10 was a flawed masterpiece, a vehicle whose imperfections helped define its legacy just as much as its strengths. And today, as collectors restore these trucks and bring them back to life, they uncover the reality hidden beneath layers of nostalgia. The C10 was never perfect, and that imperfection is precisely what makes it timeless. Restoring one is not merely a mechanical task, it is an act of preserving history, embracing both the beauty and the shortcomings of a truck that shaped American culture. Every rusted panel, every worn bushing, every cracked dashboard tells a story of years lived and miles traveled. These silent stories are what owners protect when they keep these trucks on the road, carrying forward a legacy that was built not on perfection, but on character. In the end, the Chevrolet C10 remains an icon not because it lacked defects, but because it inspired loyalty despite them. Its flaws, hidden or ignored for decades, reveal a deeper truth. The bond between a driver and a machine is often strongest when the machine demands effort, patience, and understanding. The C10 was never just a truck. It was a partner, a challenge, a companion that reflected the rugged spirit of the era. And even today, long after its production ended, those hidden defects continue to remind us that greatness is not born from perfection, but from resilience, history, and the stories we choose to preserve.